Hello there. This is the fourth video in our looking at tips and tricks, things to do and things not to do when using Fluid Designer for 3D printing. We strongly recommend you watch videos 1 to 3 and go over and learn about the topics that have just been showed on the screen to you there. But what I'm going to talk about in this video, first of all, is object overlapping. So if you purchase any of our jewellery files, it's very important that you don't overlay objects when using the arrays. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we go to Fluid Designer for 3D printing, if we go to pendants or earrings, and then scroll down to, I'm going to use this object here, this Celtic knot pendant with 4 leaves. And well, first of all, if I just zoom in, one thing to notice is that there's a kind of sort of straight chunky sections here. This is actually a Bezier curve, this object, and in previous videos, the previous video, we talked about converting these to NURBS curves instead of Bezier curves. If you do that, you will really escalate the file size here and the mesh size. I did it earlier, and I ended up with a mesh size of 2 million meshes and a 100 megabyte file, which is much too big. So you do have to consider, as I said in the previous video, whether or not to keep this kind of chunkiness here or to smooth it off by changing this to a NURBS curve. In this instance, I'm going to keep that. Now, you've got to remember that the real size of this is really going to be like that when it's 3D printed, so you're probably not going to see the problem. Alright, so what are we going to talk about here? Well, I'm going to talk about arrays. Well, both of these are modifiers, and they're both arrays. Set the rows, for example, allows me to create something like an earring out of this original pattern. I'm going to look at set the columns. And if I click on this here and do count 2, count 3, notice it's kind of going around in a circle, and that's because this object offset here, angular rotation, this box is ticked. So when I go to 4 and 5 and 6, nothing seems to be happening. Well, what's happening is 4, 5 and 6 are on top of 1, 2 and 3. And you've really got to be careful and avoid that in Fluid Designer. Otherwise, when you go to Netfabb Basic, you'll have real problems. So if I set that to 3, now why is it 3? Well, it's rotating about this object here, this angular rotation. And so if I select that object and click on main information, you'll see we've got this rotation value of 120 degrees here. That's this object has got a Z value of 120. 3 times 120 is 360. If I change that to 90 degrees, 1, 2, 3, 4 times 90 is 360. So if I go back to my Celtic knot pattern now and go to set the columns, if I change this to 4, that is one complete circle of this pattern. That is below the complete circle, and maybe you actually want to use that design or even that design. But if you want to complete the pattern around the circle, you need to go to 4. Now I'm going to show you what happens if you accidentally go to 5 or 6. What's going to happen is you're going to have a problem, because 5 is exactly on top of the original object here. Okay, and let's see what happens when we try and run this through Netfabb Basic. So if I go to File and Export, and export it as a wavefront object to the desktop, and I just delete master and the number there, and I'm just going to save it as Celtic knot pendant 4 leaf, and just export that to the desktop. Now in Fluid Designer, when you do that, what Fluid Designer will do is it will apply the modifiers. So it will apply these modifiers here and confirm this shape, and it will also change it to a mesh as well. At the moment this isn't a mesh. If we just click over here, you can see it's actually still a curve, and it's always best, as we advised in the first video, to keep these objects as curves think that was actually rounded, wasn't it? Yeah. Keep them as curves rather than changing to the meshes. Only do that by going to File and Export. So if we go over to Netfabb Basic now and go to Project and Open, and let's see what actually happens. So if I open this Celtic knot pattern, we'll get a warning red triangle, which is not unfamiliar. Oh, we haven't actually. That's very unusual. We didn't get a warning red triangle this time, but let's look what happens when we run the repair procedure and update that and run automatic repair and execute it. And notice we've got 5 shells. We have got 5 versions of this. It looks okay at the moment. There's no border edge or orientation problems or holes. But when we click update, look what's happening. We've got 18,896 invalid orientation. Now if I click apply repair and remove the old part, you can see that one corner of this object we've got these black lines. Now what's happening is you've got 2 shells there in that corner sat in exactly the same place, and Netfabb Basic is just a mathematical routine that's run, and it tries to sort out the inside and the outside of all the different meshes that make up the object, and in this instance there are about 2,000 meshes. But what's happening is because 2 objects are on top of each other, it gets confused. The software gets confused. And if you try and save this and then send it to Shapeways or try and send it to your slicer to be printed, the chances are all this corner will be missing. So that's the issue. Now if we continue through Netfabb here and export it as a wavefront object and try and save it, you'll see that we get some problems here, manifold edges, and you can see here, if I run this, it says it's okay. It isn't. Okay, so if you've got invalid orientation in your object, you've got to be very, very careful. Don't just send it straight to Shapeways to be printed. Upload it to Shapeways if you want to try it, and look very carefully at what their system says the object looks like. The chances are this whole corner will be missing, and you won't get the design that you're expecting. So the thing to do is to be very wary when using these objects here. When using arrays, make absolutely certain that you just complete the circle. You don't go beyond the circle, otherwise you will come across problems. Okay, so that's object overlapping. Be very careful with that. Now the final thing that I want to talk about in this video series is set the curve data dimensions to 2D when using pendant and earring objects. So if I go back to Fluid Designer for 3D printing, so if I go to File and New and Start Up, so I'm talking about these objects here that have been pre-built for you and which you can use to create pendants. And it doesn't matter which one of these you use, they all have this same effect, or rather all the angular ones do. And what I'm talking about is if you zoom in here, you can see that there is a kind of crease in the corner, and it occurs in all the corners of these objects. And that's just how the geometry works, because we're using curves here. Remember, if I remove that cross section, this is a curve. We're using curves here, and we're wrapping curves around corners. And so you end up with this slightly odd corner here. Now if you're happy with that, and remember the real object is only going to be quite small like that when it's printed, so the real distortion there is not going to be great. But if you want to actually tidy that up, after you've actually added objects to the center of your pendant or earring, what you can do to tidy this up is to change this value here. Change it from 3D to 2D. And can you see what happens there? When you do that, it just tidies up the corner. So there's 3D and there is 2D. Now the only reason that we've left it at 3D like that is that when you're working with this, it limits what you can do in the Z-axis if you select 2D. With 2D, you're not supposed to be able to modify the Z-axis. Now that doesn't quite apply to the way that we work here parametrically, but just in case it made any problems, we've left it at 3D. So if you do want to tidy that corner up, if you're not happy with that, after you've created your pendant or earring, added your various objects to the center here, just switch that back to 2D before you go to File and export it as a wavefront object. So that's just one minor issue with those objects. And as I say, it's in the pendants folder and in the earrings folder as well. The same thing applies to all of these earrings here, or all of this type. You can see when you zoom in, you've got that little nick in the corner there. Change it to 2D and it will just tidy it up for you. Okay, so that's it. That's video 4 in this series on tips and tricks of using Fluid Designer for 3D printing. Thank you.